Good morning, everyone. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is exactly what Masha asked you not to do yesterday. So I want you to take your mobile phones and connect to the internet. So you can either connect to Wi-Fi or you try to connect, if you can connect to the internet through your mobile network, that's fine too, right? Try to do this, because it works sometimes. On my mobile phone, sometimes it works, right? You can connect to the Wi-Fi network, and usually it works. It's slow, but we don't need it fast, okay? So while you're doing this, you can do it on your computer too, yeah? So while you're doing this, if it's not working, then it's not working, but try to do this. While you're doing this, I'll say a few introductory words. As you've probably noticed already by looking at the title of the first slide, I've changed one of the presentations I'm going to make compared to the original plan, right? So the original plan was to present something on the randomized controlled trials in education, and the second presentation should have been on the use of big administrative data in education. I've changed it, right? So both presentations today are going to be on the randomized controlled trials. For those people who just arrived, can you please take your mobile phones and connect to the internet through Wi-Fi connection or your mobile network? Yes, you need to connect to the internet. Yes, you can use this network. Try to do this, right? So the reason why I've changed the presentation is that first, I think it's probably a more interesting study compared to what I wanted to present originally. Second, after listening to the presentations yesterday and on Sunday, I think that would speak well to what some of you do here, and especially to Victor's research on ethnic discrimination on the rental market in Moscow. And another reason why I decided to change the presentation is because of John, who scared me to death yesterday, because the original presentation is work in progress, and I'm not the first author. And given that it's being filmed, I decided I'm not going to take chances. I'm still going to tell you a few words about administrative data in education and what you can do with the data from the National Pupil Database if I have time in the end, right? But both presentations today are going to be on the randomized controlled trials. And we'll start with this field experiment that we've just completed. It's a joint work between myself and Andrei Sherbak, who is a political scientist at the High School of Economics in St. Petersburg, right? And it's about a field experiment on ethnic discrimination in the labor market in Russia. Now, if you connect it to the internet, what I'm going to ask you to do is the following. There is a paper it's a famous paper by two economists. It's Marian Bertrand and Senhil Mullainathan. Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakisha Jamal? It's a famous paper published about 15 years ago, 2004, in the American Economic Review, I think. We need to move it a little bit, yeah? So what I ask you to do is to answer a simple question whether you know the paper, yeah? If you've heard of it, if you've read it, if you haven't read it but you know the contents, answer yes. If it's the first time you hear the names and the title of the paper, answer no. It doesn't matter, it's not a test. The reason why I'm asking you to do this is because I want to know kind of how familiar are you with the material and with the field experiments and randomized controlled trials in general. So what you want to do, you go to this web address right here. Hopefully you can see this, I think you can. Yeah, and you answer yes and no. Now, I'll give you a couple of minutes to do this, and while you're doing this, it works perfectly on my computer, but obviously, especially when you start using a different laptop, you have problems. We'll make it work within a minute or two. Yeah. All right, guys, okay.
Is a discrimination for the foreigners?
It wasn't an experiment. I hope to make it work. We are going to do it in a different way because I don't want to wait for another 10 minutes. How many people have heard of the paper? How many people have not heard of the paper? 40 to 60%. The direct poll technology that I was going to show to you is an audience response technology. You do the same But when you teach and ask your students, raise your hand if you haven't heard about the paper, no one is going to do it, a few people are going to do it. If you ask questions, you're going to have 2 or 3 people answering the questions all the time. It doesn't work. This is a free technology. What if it worked and it's straightforward? I mean, that's just poor IT here, right? It shows you on the screen how you vote on your mobile phones, how many people vote yes, how many people vote no real time, yeah? So you ask a question to your students if you teach, and you get the response here, and it's free, and it works all right usually. I've used it many times. The first time it's not working, yeah? Directpoll.com. Okay, so the paper, Bertrand and Mullainathan, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakesh and Jamal? What did they do in their paper? It's a fairly simple experiment. What they did, they were interested in racial discrimination in the American labor market. They did this paper 15 years ago. How do you measure this? What they did is the following. They created fictitious CVs of job applicants, and they randomly assigned to those CVs randomly the names that are either white names or black names, right? What is white and black name? Well, some names are associated with white Americans. It's usually white American names. For example, Emily or Greg. And some names are stereotypically African American, such as Lakesh and Jamal, right? And they tested those names, they selected those names, and randomly assigned them to CVs. Now, there is no difference in quality between black and white CVs, especially because the assignment was random, right? Then they sent those CVs out to the real existing vacancies in 2 American cities. And then they measured the callback rates. Since there is no systematic difference between black CVs and white CVs, any difference in the callback rate, in the response rate to those CVs, would be a measure of discrimination, a measure of how different the employers think of the white applicants and the African American applicants. Because everything else is on average similar, yeah? That's a field experiment. That's a very famous field experiment. It's not the first time such a field experiment was conducted. Actually, they started doing such experiments in the 60s and the 70s in Britain. So Bertrand and Mullainathan were very lucky because the paper is very well cited. It's a very famous paper. It's one of the most famous papers in experimental economics, right? They were not the first people who did this, but they did this properly, robustness checks, everything was done well, and they published in the top journal, and so the paper is well cited, yeah? It's a very famous methodology to test discrimination in the labor market, and there are literally hundreds of papers like this. Different countries, different markets, and not only ethnicity and race, but other things too. Now, what did we do? What have we done? We did a similar study in Russia. For the first time, no one did this before. For the first time, we've done this. It's a larger study, it's a larger sample size, and it's a larger number of ethnic groups, and obviously these are the ethnic groups that no one tested before. And the thought that should cross your mind now when I'm telling you this is that that's boring. That's boring. Because if someone just does in a different country something that other people have done in the US, Western Europe, just replicating the design and applying it to a new country, that's not a good study. It may be a good study from an applied sense, but you're not going to publish this well. So it's usually not a good strategy to take something that people have done before and apply it to a new case, unless you think the case is really special, and there are theoretical reasons to do this. Yeah? So that's not enough. That's not good enough. That's interesting, but that's not good enough. Most importantly, what they did, the most important new finding, and that's a very new finding, and not many papers before looked at it, is that we find dramatic differences in how these employers' preferences in regard to ethnicity of the job applicants vary across different regions in Russia. And that's what they didn't do in their original American paper. And that's what people didn't do in most papers, in most experiments done in the UK, Germany, Norway, Spain, you name it. Yeah? So that's the most important contribution here, the regional differences. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to break completely the usual structure of the presentation. The usual structure of the presentation is that you present literature, you present your research questions, you present your methodology, you present your data, then you present your results. I'm going to show you the results first. You know the methodology right now. I have explained it to you. Before I was going to show you the results, I wanted to do another direct poll. I'm not going to do this because it doesn't work. So I was going to ask you to guess the results, right? So I was going to show you a list of ethnic groups, Ukrainians, Jews, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Tatars, and guess which one you think would be discriminated. I'm not going to do this now because of the technology. I think it would have been an interesting exercise for you to try to guess my results, because sometimes people think, the stuff we do in social sciences is obvious. You get these results, you think, of course it is this way. Why have they done this with the research? It's clear anyway. It's obvious. So I just wanted to check whether it is obvious or it is not obvious, right? Cannot do this, but all right. So we'll move straight to the results. These are my results. What are these? These are the ethnic groups we had in this study. This is the probability of an employer contacting the applicants, right? You send those CVs out. What you get back, either someone calls you or sends you a message and invites you for an interview, or they don't. If they invite you for an interview, that's 1. If they don't invite you for an interview, that's 0. Then you can calculate the proportion of people who were invited into the interview in each ethnic group, and that's the probability of being contacted, right? So what you see here are the point estimates for each ethnic group and the confidence intervals. Let's look at this. Interesting, right? So what do we see? We do see the differences. And if you look at the confidence intervals, you would think that these differences are probably statistically significant. They are between some groups, right? And which groups do we have on the top? We have, interestingly, that's the only study where we don't have the in-group on the very top. That's not Russians, that's the Jewish people on the very top. Now, this is the same. This is not statistically significant. You can't say that the Jewish candidates were invited for the interview more often than the Russian candidates. No, it could be otherwise. So it's just random, right? What you can say that there is not much discrimination or difference going on between these two groups. So you have the Jewish applicants, you have the ethnic Russians applicants, you have the Ukrainian applicants, and we did choose the stereotypically Ukrainian names. You have the applicants with German names, with Latvian and Lithuanian names. We have combined these two groups together, and I'll explain later why. The same applies to these groups, right? And these 4 groups, they have approximately the same contact rates, right? Approximately the same, slight difference. The Latvians and Lithuanians are somewhere behind. And then you have Tatars, then you have Tajiks and Uzbeks, then you have Chechens and Azerbaijanis, then you have Armenians, then you have Georgians. And all these groups also have approximately the same contact rates, which is significantly lower than the contact rates for the groups that are here at the top. So what do we see here? What's interesting here? Well, a couple of things. For the structure of this ethnic hierarchy, you can clearly see that all the ethnic groups of the European origin are on the top, and all the ethnic groups of, let's call it, southern origin, right? That can be Central Asia, it can be the Caucasus. In the case of Tatars, it's the Volga region, non-European origin, right? At the bottom of this ethnic hierarchy. You can also see a couple of surprising findings. What about anti-Semitism in Russia? It's gone. Yeah? There's not much left in the labor market, according to this data, right? That's interesting. What about the attitudes to Ukrainian applicants? The whole thing was done right after and in the middle, you can say, of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. All the anti-Ukrainian I'm looking for the word propaganda, or kind of, I'd say propaganda in the media, right? Did it affect the attitudes of ordinary Russian employees to the Ukrainian candidates? Apparently no, yeah? Not much going on here. Well, I can't say whether it affected or not. I don't know what was before, right? It's not the before and after design, but apparently that's not something that is going on here. These guys, Armenians and Georgians, at the very bottom. Yeah.
So one of the problems of Bertrand and Muller-Nathan is they don't correct properly for the possibility of statistical discrimination. Are you doing that here?
I'll explain this a bit later. Armenians and Georgians, these are two groups that usually have higher levels of education in Russia than some other immigrant groups, right? So you would expect, they're not Muslim groups, they're Christian groups. So if you think it's about religion, if you think it's about education and labor market, they shouldn't have been at the very bottom, right? But they are. So a couple of interesting things here. But that's not interesting. That's interesting, but that's not interesting. The interesting stuff you see when we compare the two sites where we conducted the experiment. So when we compare Moscow and St. Petersburg on the one hand, and Kazan and Ufa on the other hand. That's when you see the interesting stuff. Shouldn't Walker have a pointer? That's what we see. The same plot, red lines, Moscow and St. Petersburg, green lines, so is it blue, blue lines, Kazan and Ufa. So first thing you can see is that in Kazan and Ufa, the contact rates are a bit higher. That's just how the labor markets work in both cities. That's not interesting. But what's interesting is that basically what you see here, that the whole discrimination that we see in the sample comes from Moscow and St. Petersburg. That's the red lines. That's where the real difference between these guys on the one hand and these guys on the other hand is, right? If you look at the blue lines and the point estimates, that's about, all the same. There's a slight difference. The contact rates here with the blue lines are slightly higher than here. I can tell you that's not statistically significant. But essentially, the bottom line here, the story here is that you have discrimination in Moscow and St. Petersburg. You don't have discrimination, or have very little discrimination in Kazan and Ufa. And then you immediately can start thinking, why? Is it because they are ethnic regions? Is it because of the ethnic structure of the population? We can talk about this a bit later, right? But that's the main thing. That's the main finding. I think it's a very interesting finding. It's one of the first cases in the international literature, and there is a large international literature on this, where you find no discrimination, similar contact rates for all the groups, right? Because usually you find everywhere. Australia, Canada, the US, the UK, you always find the in-group is preferred to out-groups. And you always find that's about the preference, the size of the preference, the effect size being about the same in all those locations. That's one of the first locations where you don't find it. So that's what, that is what makes it interesting, right? And that is, I think, what it makes it interesting, makes it special in the international literature. Okay, now you know the results. Let's talk about how we have done this. Yes, and why we have done this, and about statistical discrimination and taste-based discrimination, all this stuff. And most importantly, what this means, right? These are just the numbers, how we can interpret this. So why we see what we see. Right, so the study background, that was a study funded, there is a study funded by the British Academy, that's the International Partnership and Mobility Grant, where interestingly I represent Britain. My co-author, Andrei, represents Russia, so we are cooperating in a kind of international fashion with him. It's also supported by the HSC Scientific Fund on Andrei's side, and Laboratory for Comparative Social Research. Conducted the data collection last year, so it was finished in January this year. And I say thank you to 6 research assistants who worked on this program, on this project. I want to say their names: Alisa Aliyeva, Sergei Kononcev, Vladislav Kostin, Anastasia Rudь, Pavel Savchenko, and Daria Smirnova. They are all students at the HSC in St. Petersburg. Right? What's new in this study? How we think it? First, I think there are three types, two or three, depending on whether you want to consider the third point to be an innovation, 2 or 3 innovations here. First, most of this literature and all of the economic literature on this, most of those experiments were conducted by economists. There are some conducted by sociologists, but not many. But sociologists completely adopted the economist theoretical framework. It's all about statistical versus taste-based discrimination. And we'll talk about what these things are in a second. What is statistical discrimination, what is taste-based discrimination, right? It is a possible way to look at those things. It's not the only possible way. I'm not very interested here in statistical or taste-based discrimination. I'm much more interested in testing some hypotheses coming from the social psychological literature about how people make these decisions and about why employees' preferences can be different across different locations. Right? So we are kind of stepping away from the usual theoretical line, let's test statistical versus test-based discrimination, not doing this. Not interested. It's possible, just I don't see it interesting. As I said already, the methodological and also theoretical, because we get interesting results, innovation here is testing the regional heterogeneity and employees' preferences. There's only one study in China where it was done before, and they got similar results, but our design is stronger. I'll show you in a second. And as I said already, that the first correspondence study, these tests are usually called correspondence tests or audit studies, 2 names, meaning generally speaking the same, slight difference, but we are not going to go into this now. And the sample size we have is one of the largest in the international literature. That's important because many of these studies are underpowered. And people usually don't check this. We do, right? So let's talk about the statistical and taste-based discrimination. When I present this to sociologists, sometimes they don't even mention this, but given that I think it's important here, I will. Okay, that the usual approach to explaining discrimination in the literature, starting from the ideas of Gary Becker and Arrow. And what is statistical discrimination? Statistical discrimination is the following statement: I will not hire people from group X because I think they are lazy, right? I don't mind if I meet someone from group X and they are not lazy, right? I don't mind. I'm going to hire them. That's fine. But I just think that on average they are lazy and it's kind of a screening device for me, right? Taste-based discrimination is different. I will not hire people from group X because I don't like them. They may be lazy or maybe hardworking, I just don't like them. That's one version. The other version of the statement would be that, I mean, I don't mind, but my customers don't like them. So if my customers don't like them, I don't like them too. Yeah. And the usual way, there's 2 mechanisms for discrimination. The usual way to test this in the literature and to separate this effect would be to vary the quality of the applications. So for example, in the Bertrand and Molay-Nathan paper, they sent 4 applications to each job they applied for. So 2 white applications and 2 black applications. And for these 2 white and 2 black applications, different in terms of the quality of the application, right? So some people were more educated, for example, or their applications or the CVs were more developed than others. And the idea here that if it's statistical discrimination for the high quality applications, the discrimination must be lower. Because then the employer says, okay, this guy is African American, but he is well educated, great CV. I'm not racist, I just thought, that's a low quality candidate, but now I see that it is not. That's fine, yeah? So that's the idea. I don't find this particularly convincing as a test. And if you look at the recent review of the literature written by Bertrand and Esther Duflo, that was published last year, I think they don't find it particularly convincing too. Right, because, well, education may not, usually it's done by varying levels of education. It's not the only thing employers are looking at, right? Or if they don't care about education, what if they think, I'm not going to hire this Russian guy because he drinks all the time. Even if he has a high education, good degree, I mean, that's my suspicion. You always, it's the usual thing with unobservables. You can always say that there are unobservables here, unobservable there, right? And it's difficult the results are contradictory from these tests, and it's difficult to make sense of them, to be honest. And the other reason, and more important reason why I'm not particularly interested in this, is that I just don't think that's how employers make decisions. Just don't think they sit there and think, okay, is it because, statistical or taste-based, do I like them, or is it about my customers? I think it's subconscious, right? Okay, it's standard criticism against kind of a rational actor approach. I'm not very much interested in going into this discussion. But the literature, the recent literature in this field suggests that it's not explicit prejudice. It's not that's something that people are aware of. If you look at the tests on implicit prejudice, how many people know about the tests on implicit prejudice? Can you raise your hand? Yeah, one. A test on implicit prejudice test your implicit prejudice, something that maybe you may not be aware of. And I'm not going to tell you how they do this because I want you to actually go to the website implicit.harvard.edu and try a test yourself. Not now, you can do it later. It will take you 30 minutes, but it's an interesting experience. I've done this, and what I got as a result was very different from what I thought my preferences were. I got some results that were upsetting for me, actually. We are not always aware of those preferences, of those prejudices, of the prejudice we have. And I think when you send those CVs to employer, that's how they make the decision. They don't make those decisions explicit in their mind, right? So to summarize, that's a possible way to look at things. I'm not interested in this way. What I'm interested in is this. First, this. So that comes from social psychology, from a Dutch social psychologist called Luc Hagendorn. And he wrote a few papers on so-called ethnic hierarchy that wasn't based on experiments and field experiments. That was based on the usual social distance measures and survey data. So the usual survey data, social distance measures and survey data is the following. I'll put it here. You have a survey and you ask a question, for example, what would you think if a person from group X, from Ukraine, from Azerbaijan, from Tatarstan moved to a flat next to you? What do you think? What would you think? Would you be completely positive? Would you be just positive? Would you be completely negative about this and so on, right? What do you think about having a friend from group X, right? Survey data. And then you can look at the differences in the attitudes of people to different ethnic groups, right? That's one of the ways of doing this, and there are other ways of doing this, different ways of doing this. And what they found that in many countries, if you do this exercise, you find a certain ethnic hierarchy in social distance. So people often prefer ethnic groups from Northern and Western European countries, followed by ethnic groups from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, followed by ethnic groups from Africa and Asia, right? And they find this ethnic hierarchy to be pretty universal. They find and he developed with his co-authors a theory of ethnic hierarchy that have three components, three statements. The first statement is that the contact within group is always preferred. So on average, Russians will prefer social contact with other Russians, English with other English, Italians with other Italians, right? So your own group is always preferred. It's called in-group preference. Second point is in-group consensus. And the members of the ethnic group generally agree on the hierarchy of their preference in regard to other ethnic groups. So there is some kind of consensus within the ethnic group, which groups have higher status and which groups have lower status, right? And the third statement here is intergroup consensus, and that's the most interesting part of it. Intergroup consensus is that the low status group often accept the hierarchy by high status group, right? And I'll explain to you what it means using my own study that I published 2 years ago in the European Sociological Review. That wasn't an experiment. It was a pretty standard study about the attitudes to immigrants. I had a survey data on Russia, and I looked at the attitudes of Russians to immigrants. What I found in the end is pretty interesting, because what was good about the data I had, it was good, a large data set collected by the Public Opinion Foundation Russia, FORM. Right? I don't remember now how many observations. I think it was about 30,000 observations in different regions. And they ask about attitudes to different groups of immigrants, to Ukrainians, to Azerbaijanis, to people from the Northern Caucasus, to people from Central Asia. So you could compare the attitudes. And then what you compare the attitudes and you find that Russians on average, they prefer contacts with, they don't mind Ukrainian immigration, they don't mind too much immigration from Moldova, but when it comes to Central Asia, when it comes to the Caucasus, they are against it. That's something we would expect to find in the data. And if you ask why, the obvious answer would be, of course, because of cultural proximity. Of course, Russians don't mind Ukrainians, brothers, so similar to us, and yeah, that's, similar cultures. An obvious answer, right? Not true. The answer doesn't work because the sample size is large enough to look at the attitudes of not ethnically Russian people living in Russia, of Tatars, of the Uzbeks living in Russia, of other groups living in Russia. And if you think about the attitudes of Tatars, what would we expect those attitudes to be? Okay, in-group preference, but there wasn't a question about attitudes to Tatars in that survey. They would prefer maybe groups that are culturally similar. Who are culturally similar? For example, people from Central Asia, same religion, same linguistic groups, right? Not true. They have the same ethnic hierarchy. They still prefer Ukrainians. People from Central Asia, asked about the social distance, what kind of families would you prefer living next to you, still have the same ethnic hierarchy. They prefer Ukrainians, they're Moldovans, than Central Asians, right? That's interesting, that's counterintuitive. So there's a universal ethnic hierarchy here, and that's called intergroup consensus, right? So why the original intention, motivation for doing this experiment was just to look at the ethnic hierarchy, yeah? To have a larger number of groups. Because usually people have 1 group, 2 groups, 4 groups, maybe 3 groups. I wanted to have more, 10, and look at how the preferences of employers are different in regard to different ethnic groups. And the second motivation for this comes from the old social psychological literature, Allport 1954, that's a contact theory, intergroup contact theory. And it said that it was all formulated in the context of racial relations in the US. And it said that regular contact with the members of outgroups generally improves the attitudes under certain conditions, right? So if you hate people from group X, but then you meet someone from group X and he or she is a nice person and you establish some friendship and you start meeting these people regularly, you kind of change your attitudes, right? That's very difficult to test. Because usually you have cross-sectional data and then you do find all the time that people who have contact with more often with outgroups, they have better attitude to outgroups, but what comes first is not clear here, right? Do they have better attitudes because they had contact? On the other way around, they had contact because they had better attitudes in the first place, right? Longitudinal data are rare, and it's still not straightforward how to test this, right? But if it's true, then the ethnic structure of the population may be important, right? Because in places like Kazan, where you have half of the populations who are ethnic Russians and half of the population who are Tatars, you obviously have more intergroup contact, right? So it's not a very strict test, but you would expect a different ethnic hierarchy here, perhaps, and different attitudes, right? So that's the second motivation. And the third motivation mostly comes from my co-author, who is a political scientist, right? It's about ethnic federalism. Russia is a federal state, in theory at least, right? And the recent discussion, the recent literature in political science about this is that, okay, it's called a federal state, but it's not a federal state any longer because basically the regions don't have much autonomy, right? Everything is centralized, right? And he was interested to what extent it's true and to what extent this federalism is still important for ethnic issues, right? Right? And is it just the ethnic structure of the population that needs to be quite heterogeneous for high probability of intergroup contact? Or is it something else? Does it need to be an institutional status of ethnic minorities that is still present in ethnic republic that is important, right? Because if you look at the regional motivation, the regional idea for Russian ethnic federalism and the Soviet ethnic policies, there was some preference given to so-called titular groups. That would be Tatars in Tatarstan, Bashkirs in Bashkortostan, Buryats and Buryatia, and so on. So they were given more access to the labor market, to certain parts of the labor market. They were the original Soviet nationalist policies in the 20s, formulated in the 20s, actually separated between more developed, advanced ethnic groups that were usually groups of the European origin, such as the Ukrainians or Baltic ethnic groups, right? That didn't need the help from the state, and less advanced ethnic groups that were usually groups of Asian origin that needed some support, and the Soviet state tried to develop their languages and so on. Yeah, origins, and there were some preferences given to the titulars in those ethnic republics. This is still the case. Do we see this in the labor market? That's the question. Yeah. So these are the motivations. And this, we found this study after we finished our data collection and analysis, actually. But it's an interesting study. It's a similar experiment conducted in China by Maurer Fazio, published 6 years ago, right? Also a large study. And they did it in different provinces in China, in different regions. And in most regions, they found what people usually find, the preference given to Han, right? To the ethnic Chinese. Apart from two regions, and the first region was Inner Mongolia. They only had two groups in Inner Mongolia, Mongolians and Chinese. There was no difference. And the second region was Urumqi, which is the capital of the Uyghur Autonomous Region, right? Uyghurs are Turkic people, Muslims living in China. And again, the same result, no difference. They compared Uyghurs and they compared Chinese, and there was no difference in the contact rates. Now, the sample sizes in those regions were not particularly great, so they had a problem with the power. They only had two groups, but the results go in the same direction. Yeah.
One question that I always have with these kind of studies is, what about the ethnicity of the employer? And could that drive the results here? So,
yeah.
So maybe the employers in Mongolia are partly Chinese.
About here, I'm not sure.
And same in Urumqi.
Ask Maurer Fazio, but I'll tell you about our study.
Okay.
Yeah? That's definitely one of the options. Yeah. Yeah, come on,
So
let's go.
I want to come back to the why you can't ignore statistical discrimination. So the original problem with Bertrand and Mullainathan, which they ignored, and I was shocked it got into the AER, is that the choice of names signals some social qualities of the family. So it turns out, even among purely black Americans, differences in names between white-sounding names and black-sounding names is a signal of socioeconomic status. But Levitt and Fryer show, controlling for initial socioeconomic status, names don't matter. So the discrimination would be purely statistical. Otherwise, there would be an effect of the name difference in terms of the outcomes. And Bertrand and Mullainathan do not control for this at all. The CV control is a very weak one. So what I would ask you to tell me is, for example, I would bet if you did this following study in Russia, Muslim families in Russia who give their kids distinctively Muslim names are sociologically different from Muslim families who name their kids Vladimir and Anton.
And that's not the only problem they had in their study. They had not a large number of names. And if you look at the distribution of their response rates, and that's something that, what's his name, Michael Gaddis did recently, actually all the results driven by 2 or 3 names. We have a larger number of names, and I will tell you about this in a second. Right, so but then what we do, I need to speed up a little bit. I have 15 minutes. So, first thing, we wanted to choose the locations for the experiment. 2 were clear, Moscow and Pittsburgh, and then we wanted, the original idea was to tell the ethnic stuff, right? Heterogeneity. We wanted to find 2 ethnic regions, cities, because you can't do this in the countryside. The cities that were large enough to generate a sufficient number of the resumes and developed enough so that people are looking for jobs on the internet, because we did this on the internet. So Kazan and Ufa, 2 locations with more ethnically mixed population, to the capitals of the ethnic republics, were the obvious candidates for this, right? So we chose Kazan and Ufa. The ethnic structure of the cities, these are the data coming from the census, and these are not very good data because they severely underestimate recent immigration, especially in Moscow and also in St. Petersburg. But generally, that's about this. So Moscow and St. Petersburg Russians would be about between 80 and 90% of the population, right? Kazan and Ufa, Kazan Russians have 50%, Tatars 50%. Ufa was founded as a Russian city. in the 18th century. Half of the population are ethnic Russians, then you have 30% Tatars and about 20% Bashkirs. Okay? Then we wanted to choose the ethnic groups. We couldn't have too many. I wanted to have many because that's about it. That's about ethnic hierarchy. We couldn't have too many because, you know, logistic issues. If you have many ethnic groups, you need to generate very many resumes, right? But we also wanted groups from different regions of origin. So these are the ones we ended up choosing. If I could do this again, I would do it slightly different. But you know, you do it once, you make this decision, and you have to stick with this. So we have obviously the in-group, the ethnic Russians, and we have Armenians, Azeris, Chechens, Georgians, all coming from the Caucasus, different parts of the Caucasus. Also different religious backgrounds. Azeris and Chechens are Muslim, Georgians and Armenians are Christian groups. Tatars from the Volga region, Tajiks, Uzbeks, to large immigrant groups in Russia from Central Asia. Germans, these are the descendants of those German immigrants who came to Russia in the 18th century. Mostly they are, most of them went to Germany already. So this, according to the census in 2010, still 40,000 of them live in Russia. They are very, very heavily Russified, right? Jews, Latvians, and Lithuanians, there are very few of them in Russia, but we just selected those groups because we wanted to test. We wanted different regions of origin, and we wanted more Eastern European groups, right? And Ukrainians. That's what Bertrand and Mulanathan did. And actually, they did it. And it's funny. It's literature is actually funny sometimes. They obviously, you need to test whether people recognize the signal, whether they recognize the ethnic names as ethnic names. So they did this. They did this with a sample of students. Most people after this, they did the study, similar studies after their study, they didn't test for the names, and moreover, they borrowed the names from their study. So Lakeisha and Jamal are traveling from one study to another study to another study, and I think most American employees, because in the US you had 100 of those studies, 50. Yeah, they now know Jamal means, yeah, that's an experiment. Yeah. So, but we decided we obviously needed to test this here. And what we did, that's the whole budget for the study for 3 years is £27,000. That's nothing, right? So we couldn't do a professional survey. So what we did, we designed the survey on Qualtrics, and I just advertised it on Facebook, and it was a snowball sample. I know some people here participated in the survey that I advertised on Facebook. And we just asked people, it was open-ended question, we would give them a list of names and ask to type which ethnic group they think this name comes from. Right, so not a probability sample, mostly Moscow and St. Petersburg, mostly women, not men. We don't need a probability sample here though, because we are interested in, ideally, if I could have a probability sample, I would, right? But I couldn't. But that's not too bad because the HR people who actually screen the candidates, they don't come from the probability sample either, right? So these are examples of the names. Russians, Kirill Petukhov, Irina Bordina, Andrei Zagoryuk, Alexey Shevchuk, Ukrainian names. We did select the names from Western Ukraine rather than Eastern Ukraine. Jewish names, Arkady Weissman, Galina Katz, German, Vladimir Gerber, Tatiana Keller, Latvian, Arnis Azolins, Ilze Priede, Lithuanian, Lukas Daktaras, Agne Mikailaite, Georgians, Kobamais. That's not, it's just examples, we had more, right? These are just two examples, one male, one female. Georgian, Koba Maisuradze, Lala Gilashvili, Armenian, Aram Balayan, Zara Milikian, Tatar Avil Gafiatulin, it should be. Эльмира Камалеева, Азербайджане, Вугар Хусейнов, Арзу Мамадова, Чечен Умар Сатуев, Марха Ибрагимова, Таджик Парвин Мирзоев, Нигин Рахмонов, Uzbek. I know you have a couple of people from Uzbekistan here, so I'm a bit scared here because we didn't check the names with the native speakers. The way we did this, we looked at the social media websites, we collected some popular names from Uzbekistan, from Tajikistan, recombined the first name and the second name. So for Uzbekistan, we have Daston Ibadulayev, Farida Sadikova. Does it sound Uzbek to you? Ethnic names recognition, very different across the groups. Everyone recognizes Georgian and Armenian names, they're easy. Adze, Shvili for Georgian names, Yan for Armenian names. Very good recognition rates. Everyone immediately says that Georgian and Armenian. Russian names are also well recognized. It's only 88 here because some people, 12% of people, they start thinking, okay, that cannot be just Russian. That's something Kazakh. or that's maybe Mordvin, but you know, Russified. So but most people do recognize it. Ukrainian names are well recognized actually, and they're recognized as Ukrainian names, not Russian names. Yeah. Jewish names are well recognized, status 57%, and for Uzbek names, for example, 19%. Very low recognition rates. But no one recognizes them as Russian names. So people understand these are not Russian names, but they cannot, you know, point out exactly where the names comes from. Yes?
So this is what I was asking. When I look at your examples, they're consistently ethnic. What I want to know is if you take a sample with an Uzbek family name, but randomized between an Uzbek first name and a Slavic first name, what happens?
That's an interesting continuation of this. You know what, I'm not interested here in this study in the reaction to the indiscrimination against real, I'll explain this. It's different of the focus. You can be interested in the discrimination against African Americans in the US, that's one, in the labor market, that's one type of question. Another type of question is just like a psychological reaction to stereotypically black or stereotypically African American names. Some African Americans wouldn't have these names, and we completely miss them out. You are completely right here, I agree. But I'm more interested in the second type of question. Some Uzbek candidates would have more Russified names perhaps in Russia, and some Ukrainians, especially coming from Eastern Ukraine, would have the name that almost very similar to the point of confusion to the Russian names, right? Not interested in this. I'm interested in catching the stereotypes. So that's why I have stereotypical names. That doesn't reflect the real discrimination on the labor market. It reflects it only partly. There is a bias here, yeah? That's for sure. But I'm interested, it's a difference between an economic question and a kind of social psychological question. They are similar, right? But it's slightly different. Occupations that turn out to be not very important. We did have 4 occupations. There was some logic here. We had 2 occupations that are low-skilled, salesperson and cook, and 2 high-skilled, sales manager, computer programmer, and different level of the contact with the customer. That could be important too, right? Regular contact, that would be sales manager and salesperson. Rare contact, computer programmer or cook, turn out not to be very important in the end. So the design. We had 2 most popular job search websites. Not going to tell you the names of the websites. And the way it works, you create an account here on the website, yeah? And then you apply on the website. You apply for a job advertised by employees on the website. You don't need to send the CV as a PDF file. You have to fill it in on the website, which is a pain, because if it was a PDF document, we could generate it automatically. On the website, it's more difficult, right? So we had to do this manually. You send it out, and then the employee can either contact you if they want to invite you for an interview on the website, or they can call, which also is painful. Because what they did in the US is the employers would leave a text message on the phone, and then you would just register the count, count the number of text messages left, right? We don't do it in Russia. We don't leave these messages. They would just hang up, right? So you need to have someone on the phone actually answering these phone calls. And that's my 6 research assistants. And that's 9,000 applications, think about this, right? So I'm not going into...
From different minorities for Tajik?
No, they had, I would tell you more, but I have about 7 minutes now, so I need to finish, and then I'll answer the questions in the end, okay? We had to combine some ethnic groups, which I think with hindsight wasn't the best decision, but again, you make the decision, you have to stick with this. We combined the ones we thought are similar, Azeris, Chechens, Latvians, Lithuanians, Tajiks, and Uzbeks, it's kind of same region, right? And obviously now we can estimate the rates only for combined groups. That wasn't the best decision, actually, because, you know. But the reason why we did this is that it's a full factorial design, 10 ethnic groups after we combined, yeah? 2 genders, male and female, 4 cities, 4 applications, 10 times 2 times 4 times 4, 320 applications, 320 accounts to be created on the websites. To create an account takes an hour, 320 hours. It's a lot of work, even for 6 research assistants. And we started with 2 research assistants. Then the HSC in St. Petersburg, they gave us a bit of money to hire a bit more, yeah. So if it was uncombined groups, that would go over 500. I just calculated we couldn't do this. We couldn't afford it. We couldn't afford this. But maybe the right solution was to drop some groups here, not to combine. It's a cluster randomized design because what you randomize here, right, it's every name is a cluster because you have many applications coming from the same account. And we registered the responders on the website and on the phone. We did the power analysis. It's very important. In any experiment, you do an experiment, you start with a power analysis. You don't go for an experiment unless you do power analysis. What's power analysis? Statistical power is our ability to identify effects of a given size as statistically significant at a given level, right? So basically, in this context, you want to know how many applications to send. Because if you send too few, nothing is going to be statistically significant, and you'll make a wrong conclusion that there is no effect. Or strictly speaking, you don't have enough evidence to say that there is an effect when there could be an effect. That's going to be a false negative, right? So assuming power of 80%, the effect size of 10 percentage points, we calculated we needed about 8,000 job applications. And with this design, we can only make calculations for Moscow and St. Petersburg combined versus Kazan and Ufa combined. If you wanted to make separate estimates for 4 different cities, it could be 16,000, we couldn't do this, right? So we ended up doing about 10,000 applications. And that's one of the largest studies ever conducted. I think the only ones that are larger were Chinese and one in Canada. Formal results, right? Experiments, I'll tell you more about this in the second part after the break, how you actually analyze data from randomized controlled trials. But general principle is that if you have a strong design, and RCTs are a strong design, the analysis is simple. Yeah, you only need to do linear model or analysis of variance model. So that's a simple regression analysis. The ethnic Russians are a reference group. It's a linear probability model. You have a response whether you have a contact or don't. That's 1 or 0. So these coefficients show you the change in the probability as percentage points, right? Probability, yeah? Probability changes. So when I control for a few things here, you can read it on the slide. It's a randomized controlled trial, so it's not biased anyway, even if I don't control for things, but that makes it slightly more precise. So what you see here, Moscow and St. Petersburg, no discrimination here. And you do have significant discrimination of about the same size for these 5 groups and for Latvians and Lithuanians as well, but it's weaker, right? And Kazan Ufa, nothing significant, yeah? This is all negative, so if you increase the sample size, you probably get a small significant effect, yeah? But nothing significant so far. Another interesting result. You interact ethnicity and gender, and for ethnicity, I just have southern here, right? Male candidates in Moscow and St. Petersburg are discriminated more strongly compared to female candidates. And that speaks to some interesting observations in social psychological literature about threat that is perceived as mostly from males, not from females. That's a common finding in this literature. When you contact a candidate, you can do it in 2 ways, on the phone and on the website. The difference is that on the phone, you actually have to talk to them. So for those who were contacted, we looked at the differences in the probability of being contacted on the phone or on the website. And that's what you find. Yeah, in Kazan and Ufa, as usual, nothing significant, although there are some negative coefficients. Here, for all candidates, for all groups, apart from Ukrainians, but it goes in the same direction, right? The employers, compared to the ethnic Russian, they prefer just to send them a message. They don't want to talk to them. And this applies to the groups that are not discriminated against too, to Jewish candidates and German candidates. I'll answer your question after I finish. They don't talk on the phone, they send a message. It shows they try to avoid contact, right? If you don't want to invite a candidate, you can do 2 things. Just ignore them, or actually press a button on the website, I don't want to invite you. That's some extra action. It doesn't make sense. Just don't invite. You don't need to let me know, yeah? So if people do this, then maybe, have some special strong feelings. We test for this, and yes, indeed, this is the case for the discriminated groups. They are more likely to be, the employers are more likely to press the button. I don't want to invite you, so there's high probability of explicit rejection. So that's what we find. That's what we find. Difference between Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, and Ufa. Gendered ethnic stereotypes. Differences between the groups of the European origin and Southern origin in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but not Kazan and Ufa. And that's where I tried to, the plan was to talk a little bit about why I find these, why we find what we find and how we interpret these results, but I think I ran out of time. So I'll leave it on the slide. Happy to answer the questions about this. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you for your presentation. My main question concerned, it's completely counterintuitive because there is more supply, more demand in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and therefore the market power of potential employers is significantly higher. And it comes to what you're trying to say as well, with how the housing situation. The question is why? That's
a good question. That's why economists are wrong.
But I think it's not about economists right now. It's social work.
That's a nice reaction. It's not about supply and demand on the labor market. It's about your prejudice generated by group threats, right? And that comes from everyday contact. That comes from social psychology. That's not an economic logic. No, John. I didn't test for this. No.
You're assuming the answer.
I cannot test anything with n equal 2. I have two cases, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kazan and Ufa. There is no formal test to be conducted here. I have different explanations why any difference between these two locations could cause the difference in results. There is no, you could do a test, but it's a separate study, right? So all I can do is to discuss possible explanations, right, and suggest other studies. But I cannot prove that the difference between these two locations is explained by some factors and not others with this design. Yeah, Paula.
Hi. I have a question coming back to the identity of the employer. So I think that this is really an important point because you are investigating labor market. So what is the cost of the employer to have someone from a different ethnic origin? And moreover, this cost should be somehow affected by the number of applications. So do you have the number of applications for that job, first? Second, could you have some proxy for the cost of the employer about having a German employee or having someone from Asia region, whatever? Because labor market, it's a cost, is a sort of the value of the option, at least.
I don't have any information on the number of applications. I do have some information on the employers. So we did collect information about the firms we applied to. We didn't code this because coding 9,000, you need to check those firms on the internet, right? But coding 9,000 firms is not an easy thing, right? So we haven't done this.
Divided by 4, right? 9,000 firms. It's an application the same firms. It's less.
9,000 jobs, right? So 9,000. Some firms, probably get the applications twice. But so let me answer the question. And we do have some information on employers' ethnicity, but only for those who responded. Because when you respond, we ask for the name, and that doesn't have to be an employer. That's an HR person, but still, it's a proxy, right? So given that that's only the ones who responded, the only thing we could test is the difference between phone calls and website reactions and the difference between having an explicit rejection or not having an explicit rejection. So it's a kind of secondary type of test, and the ethnicity wasn't significant, right? So, but that's a poor test. I don't have any measures of the cost of employing different candidates, but again, that's not the. I'm not saying that you can't do this, but that's not. And you're right that I haven't tested for this, but that's not the way I think about this. What I'm interested, I don't think that comes from the cost. I don't think that comes from any kind of rational calculation. I think it comes from the attitudes to different ethnic groups in different locations that are shaped by the history of those locations, that are shaped by the fact that Kazan and Ufa are the capitals of the republics, of ethnic republics, with the tradition of ethnic federalism, with a different intergroup relation that was shaped by the last 300 years, 3 centuries of the relations between Russians and Tatars here. So that's the direction I'm thinking of. I'm thinking about this, and which is not to say that you cannot do the cost and benefit analysis, but it's something that I'm less interested in.
One thing I think would be really interesting to see is look at the names of the CEOs or the leaders of the firms and just code the names. Because I would expect, even if the person hiring is someone else, if you know your CEO is an Uyghur or a Tatar, it makes a very big difference for your implicit prejudices. So actually psychology could be very well influenced by having a leader from a different ethnicity, and that could explain your regional difference. Because I would expect in Ufa and Kazan, you would have more people, CEOs from different ethnicities than in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And in that case, your results are maybe driven by this in-group thing still. And another side question, why do they hate Armenians in Ufa and Kazan?
Right, I'll start with the last question. When you're making a large number of comparisons, you would expect some of them being statistically significant just by chance, so, and that's at 90% significance levels, I ignore this. It's a very interesting suggestion, just to take those 9,000 jobs, check them in the Spark database, right, the firms and the owners, and code this and see what happens. I'd love to do this, but that's coding 9,000 jobs. I can't do this myself, I don't have the money left. So if I find the money to hire research assistants and do this, I'm happy to do this. But so far, we don't have the money for this. I agree that this would have been an interesting thing to do. And I don't think, though, that the results are driven completely by the ethnicity of employers, right? So imagine, that's here, right? Imagine ethnic Russians do discriminate and Tatars don't discriminate. So if this is the case, then in Kazan and Ufa we don't have discrimination simply because these are Tatars and Bashkirs who are running those firms and they don't discriminate, and that's trivial. That's just the differences between the preferences of different employers, right? Russians, don't like Central Asians or people from the Caucasus, and Tatars don't mind. That's interesting, but that's trivial. I don't think this is the case, because if you look at the results for Kazan and Ufa, these are not, Tatars are 50% of the population, so we would need every employer to be, and we have very small discrimination, so it just doesn't, I don't just think it can explain the results completely. In Ufa, 50% of the population are Russian, and in Kazan as well. So some of the employers, we don't have this data. It's possible to collect this data, but even if we haven't collected this data, some of these employers are definitely Russian. Yeah, sure. So we would find the discrimination weaker if this is the only reason in those places, but not that much weaker, right? But we need to test this. I agree, but we haven't coded this data. I don't have the money to do this now.
I just give you a straightforward example of how you could use data with your existing test to partially control. For example, if you look at the difference for each ethnic group's crime rates versus the average in that region, is that significant once you correlate, control for that? Moreover, finding no discrimination often is discrimination. If you look at, say, Asians, they're more likely than their percentage in the population to be admitted to Harvard. But that's not controlling for their test scores. Controlling for their test scores, Asians' bias against Asians by Harvard is like 8 times that against whites. So exactly, my point is that you want to avoid the comparison to statistical discrimination, but until you control for that, measures of no discrimination don't prove no discrimination, and measures of discrimination don't prove discrimination. That's exactly the problem with Bertrand and Melanathan. If on average, a black family that gives the family a black name is likely to have social characteristics that are not considered in the resume, but a black family that gives the family a white name is likely to have different behavioral characteristics, let's say crime, then that may be partially rational. And so the assumption that merely running an RCT is enough without these controls is wrong, and all of these people are wrong. I mean, I know for PC reasons why they're published, but they are routinely criticized for this in econ job seminars. But it would not, if they had found the opposite, they would surely ask for control.
I'm happy I don't have to go to econ job seminars. I'll answer the question. I'll answer the last question because it was asked. Some of the things I cannot do, you're overestimating Russian statistics. I cannot have crime rates for different ethnic groups. This data don't exist. Some of the things I can do, I can calculate the education rates, proportion of people with high education, say across the region, that census data that exists. I probably need to do this, actually. It's a good suggestion, I will. But the question goes in the same direction. You're trying to kind of disentangle different mechanisms for discrimination. So you're trying to establish whether it's discrimination or not discrimination, and it is discrimination if having this ethnicity, the only reason for people to be invited for an interview or not invited for an interview, controlling for all other differences, right? And what you're saying, and with this design, you don't control for all other differences because the name signals not just ethnicity, but lots of unobserved or observable but things that are not in the design. That's what you're saying. Okay, how about we get rid of the word discrimination? And we talked about attitudes to different ethnic groups that could be caused by different reasons, right? It can be partly discrimination, it can be partly statistical discrimination, just high crime rates for certain groups. Although it doesn't, I mean, if you look at the data, it's interesting because Armenians and Georgians wouldn't have very high crime rates. Although I'm not saying that other groups would, but these are groups that have, the Armenians and Georgians live in Russia, quite heavily selected groups, right? So that would be usually, not universally, but on average people with high levels of education. They're at the very bottom. That's surprising, that's strange. So definitely there is some space of thinking about this and talking about this. I don't think I can do a strict test. So, and maybe I should, that's a continuation of the study. That's a different study with a stricter test for this. Thank you very much.